evidence has some fundamental foundations in its use in policy. And actually, those are irrespective of whether it's quantitative or qualitative evidence. Those foundations are about the verifiable nature of the data that's being used and how that is built into an evidence generating process. And evidence at the end of the day is really knowledge that's used in a particular context. We can use quantitative or qualitative methods depending on circumstances, and both have their merits in different contexts. One of the areas where I think that there's a real need for qualitative methods is in developing evidence assessments. But that's often built on a foundation of a very, very extensive foundation of quantitative evidence. But sometimes that foundation of quantitative evidence is so complex, it's very difficult to synthesize it into clear statements which can then be built into policy. That synthesis process is one of the areas where I think qualitative evidence plays a strong part. I think at smaller scales, qualitative evidence does play a strong part in trying to answer the question, well, why do things happen rather than how or where and these sorts of things. And of course, that's important. But a point that I want to make quite strongly is that sometimes we resort to qualitative methods when in fact we could use, if we thought about it, we could use quantitative methods. It's not appropriate in all circumstances, but very often we are looking at qualitative methods to build data out of quite small sample sizes. And having built data out of quite small sample sizes, we want to know how to express those samples in what I would call a population or a whole societal statement, or a statement about how the population or society might think about a particular issue, for example. And I think you can do that quantitatively if you collect your evidence initially with that in mind and by asking the right questions and as a result being able to do analyses on it that can actually synthesize upwards to a whole population or societal level. Yes, there's a lot of experience from doing these sorts of things, from understanding how people think about particular topics. I mentioned badger culling, for example. We know roughly what the population thinks about badger culling, and we know that from taking small samples, focus groups, understanding what those focus groups actually represent in terms of the total population, and being able to sort of interpolate to a whole population opinion about what they think about a very controversial issue. And we know that about other things like pesticides and these sorts of things. So it's a very useful methodology, but it's actually about the marrying between a qualitative type of approach and a quantitative approach. And I think there is a spectrum. You can start at one end of the spectrum, you can start at the qualitative end of the spectrum, and if you ask the questions in the right sort of way and collect the data in the right sort of way, you can actually transition that into a quantitative approach. And you can do it the other way around. As I said, with the assessment processes, you often have a huge mass of quantitative evidence, which is highly complex, and sometimes the only way of bringing that together is using qualitative assessment processes, expert opinion if you like, but it's structured inquiry into that quantitative evidence base, which then is synthesized up to come up with strong policy advice, as in the case of, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and its recommendations about how we should deal with climate.